Today we're going to be looking at Bram Stoker's novel Dracula from the late 1890s. And to start us off, I want to think about the form of the novel and the way it uses voice. Dracula is what we call a found or assembled narrative, formed out of a variety of different materials. Diaries primarily, but also letters, newspaper clippings, and memorably 4 pages of a ship's logbook when the Demeter comes to Whitby. This means that it has multiple narrators. Its main narrators are Jonathan Harker, Mina Harker, and John Seward, with brief appearances from Lucy Westenra and exactly one paragraph that's narrated by Abraham Van Helsing. So as a found narrative, it's similar in some ways to Carmilla, which is presented to us as a manuscript that has made its way to the mysterious doctor whose expert testimony it forms a part of, the preface tells us. But what's important is that Laura is writing her account of what happens with Carmilla retrospectively, right? It's been 10 years or so, and she's thinking back to what happened, which means that throughout the narrative, she possesses knowledge of the way it ends, and the voice is shaped around that. And this is similar, for instance, to Nellie Dean looking back on the events of Wuthering Heights from a distance of 20 years and telling them to Lockwood. She knows the ending. The narrators of Dracula write in the moment, and we can see this in Jonathan's diary probably most particularly from the beginning. He's figuring out what's happening with Dracula as the reader is. In fact, because it's an assembled narrative, because it's not just a single diary or a single manuscript, but rather bits and pieces from lots of different writers, most of the time the narrators possess less knowledge of what's going on than the reader does. And that's kind of an inversion of what we normally expect. We normally expect the narrative voice to know much more than we do and to kind of dole it out to us. When we think about the Gothic and unreliability, this obviously puts us much more in the category of limited knowledge for a potentially unreliable narrator rather than bias or problems with their judgment or value systems. So we don't actually think any of these narrators are lying to us, the way we might think Nellie Dean is lying to us. Instead, they're working with very limited knowledge and they're trying to piece together this bigger picture. The form of the novel reflects the content of the novel in that way, in a really important way. We see it with Mina, who becomes the editor of the whole project. So if you were to point to a single authoritative narratorial voice in the novel, it would have to be Mina because she assembles the text that we are reading. But on the whole, the project of the novel is to bring together a bunch of different people and a bunch of different knowledge to try to figure out Dracula. And the text itself, through its form, does that by assembling all these different kinds of accounts: journalism, logbooks, which are obviously an official account, diaries, letters. It's also really important to note who the main narrators are, because as you might notice looking at this list, the most famous characters from the novel, Dracula and Van Helsing, do not provide any of the narration, except for that one little paragraph that we get from Van Helsing. People tend to lose sight of who the primary voices of the novel are because there are these really charismatic characters who stand out in our mind after we finish reading. But Stoker very purposely foregrounds the 3 middle-class and professional British voices over the other characters. So over the foreign characters, so it'd be Van Helsing, Quincey Morris, and of course Dracula himself, and over the wealthy, so over Lucy Westenra and her fiancé Arthur. And this tells us really who the heroes of the story are meant to be, which again is important to note because basically every film or television adaptation of Dracula has given the status of hero to Van Helsing. He's not in the original novel. He is very much othered as a useful but a foreign character. It is very specifically the kind of working professional British people who make up the heroic band who fights Dracula and who also are in control of the narrative and in control of knowledge. What is particularly interesting is that Dracula does not only not narrate any portion of the novel that's named after him, but he's also largely absent and silent throughout the text. Dracula only appears on 37 pages out of 354 in my edition. Your mileage may vary, which is about 10% of the novel. And we can see that these appearances, which I've listed here, most of his appearances really cluster towards the beginning of the novel. So obviously most of those 37 pages come when he's in his own castle in Transylvania with Jonathan. And that's also where he does the most talking, because although he appears on the page in all of these instances, he doesn't speak in each appearance. So we never hear him say anything when he attacks Lucy. We don't hear him speak when Jonathan spots him in the streets of Piccadilly. And of course, his death, he's unconscious and therefore, again, unable to speak. And I think this is really important to note because it's a really stark contrast to some of the other monsters of Victorian Gothic who've had their fair share of film and television adaptations, like Frankenstein's monster or Dr. Jekyll. Both of those characters are given a confession, which is buried at the heart of their text. So while both Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde are similarly kind of assembled narratives with several different voices and letters and things like that coming in to make up the final product, each of them does give the key sort of core moment to a confession from the villain. So we have the passage we've looked at before from Frankenstein, where the creature quite eloquently demands that he be allowed to tell his side of things. It's an eloquent and impassioned plea for his voice to be given the same prominence that Victor's has up to that point. And we get a similar kind of core confession out of Dr. Jekyll in the chapter entitled Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. In contrast to both of these confessions, in Dracula, we never get to hear his side of the story. We don't get access to his inner thoughts. We don't get access to any of his motivations. And this leaves a lot of questions dangling at the end of the text. We might think this is something like Wuthering Heights, where of course I sort of flagged up those gaps in the narrative. But I think even more so, the whole background of what Dracula's up to is really, really mysterious. We never find out who the brides in the castle are. We, of course, call them brides of Dracula, but they're not called that in the text. Who are these women? How long have they been there with him? Where did they come from? Why does he only have 3? How did Dracula become a vampire? We find out how Carmilla's turned into a vampire, but we don't get the backstory of Dracula. Why is he so fixated on targeting England? Why does he go after Lucy? We know why he attacks Mina. That's directly revenge. But Lucy, he just seems to come upon, even though she's a person who has an intimate connection to Jonathan, who he's already encountered back in the castle. Is that an accident? Does he just happen to find the closest friend of Jonathan's fiancée? Or has he put these pieces together? And if so, why? If he's trying to target Jonathan, why wouldn't you go after Mina? What is his wider goal or plan when he gets to England? We know he has this idea about producing more vampires, but beyond that, what are his motivations? And I think probably the most mysterious, who on earth is Renfield, and what is the relationship between Renfield and Dracula? And I think these questions are really important to explaining why Dracula has become such a staple in pop culture. If you ask someone to name a kind of Gothic villain, probably Dracula is going to be the first one they think of. Everyone has seen some kind of television or film or musical or ballet adaptation of this text. And that's because people have been trying to fill in these blanks for the last 120 odd years. People have been trying to answer these questions. And so most of the film adaptations we see try to plug in motivations. And it's also why we get films like the absolutely terrible Dracula Untold from 2014, which gives us Dracula before he's a vampire and explains how he became a vampire and who he is, because people are left with this lingering desire to know more about him. And that's the really interesting way in which Dracula can be both silent and largely absent from the text, and also so incredibly charismatic and interesting. He draws all our attention, even though he's not really there, even though the most prominent people are Mina and Jonathan Harker. These gaps and absences, and the fact that Dracula never speaks for himself, also allows the text to really transcend its own historical moment. So we've talked about this before, the way in which the Gothic can kind of remain popular. And this is because of the way the Gothic moves between history and more universal theories. So Stephen Arata, in his book Fictions of Loss in the Victorian Fin de Siècle, draws our attention to this tension. He says, the divorce of Gothic from history can be traced as far back as Walter Scott's famous distinction between the two in his introduction to Waverley. We do better, however, to approach this genre by way of David Punter's sensible claim that the Gothic contains a very intense, if displaced, engagement with political and social problems. The neglect of history in Gothic studies has in part resulted from the various psychoanalytic approaches taken by most critics of the genre. So Arata here draws a distinction between historicist and psychoanalytic approaches to the text, where the former would be focused on the specific historical context of a work, and the latter would be focused on finding more universal elements to a text. And Arata is really suggesting that there's a tension between these two, right? He talks about the neglect of history in Gothic studies because psychoanalytic or universal readings have been so common and so popular. But Gothic texts can and do mobilize both the universal and the specific. And we should acknowledge that. Every text is, of course, written to specific social and political concerns, but because they're projected onto monsters rather than being incorporated in a more realist mode, the monsters can transcend the specific and become universal, or they can become specific for a new time period. The monster can always be reinterpreted. And we talked about this in the first lecture for Frankenstein as well, that the structure of the Gothic tends to be that we've got these sort of social anxieties that are projected onto a monster which can be fought and killed. But most importantly, the monsters can be reinterpreted by new readers to represent new social anxieties. And Dracula is probably the most easy to reinterpret because he is so silent and so enigmatic. We can always fill in the blanks of the text with our own anxieties and with our own sense of what his motivations might be. So in the next video, I'm going to look at some of the different readings of the text that we've seen from different critical approaches to the text.